Today we're really going to focus on the installation and sizing of vRealize Operations 6. We're going to be installing the 6.4 version, and we're going to run through the different installation and sizing options that you have when you're installing vRealize Operations. Our agenda today is first we're going to walk through an architecture refresher. What are the different pieces that you can install? How many pieces can you install? What are the different do you want to install a single node? Do you want to install a cluster? So we'll go through the architecture. We're also going to go through the sizing of vRealize Operations. We're going to spend some time here. Most of our customers that have trouble with vRealize Operations have undersized or misconfigured the sizing of the different nodes in the cluster. So I want to cover this and show you the resources that are available to be able to successfully install. Then we'll run through a couple of demos. I'm not going to show you all the bits and pieces. What I've got is a demo environment today that is different systems that are in different stages of install. We'll use this. We'll go into each one at the appropriate place. This way you don't have to watch the bits install and the bits copy or a virtual appliance come up install. But we will get through all the questions and the configuration settings for those. Last, we'll talk about other installation considerations as well as upgrade considerations from earlier versions of 6 to the current version of 6. But before we get started, I just want to run through some additional information. We have a portal. All the past Getting More Out of webinars are all on this portal, as well as a list of any of the upcoming webinars. That URL is http://www.vmware.com/go/getmore. Now again, there's over 36 different webinars, pre-recorded webinars that we've already run through. They may be on earlier versions, but all of that content is still very, very relevant to the current version. There's also some new updated vRealize Operations hands-on labs. HOLs 1701, Use Case 2, Use 3, as well as 1706, Use Case 4. These hands-on labs were premiered at VMworld in Las Vegas and were used again in VMworld in Barcelona. All three of these cover vRealize Operations in depth, and I'd really recommend looking into those to really get some good hands-on experience in how to walk through all the different parts that we were talking about today, as well as along with any of the other webinars that we've done in the past. There's some great blogs. Blogs.vmware.com/management is the official blog for VMware. VirtSanity.com, again, another great blog. He's got a great listing of other resources there as well. And just to remind you that there's VMware provides professional services on installing, configuring, optimizing vRealize Operations, as well as we have some great classes that have been updated through VMware Education. So let's talk about the architecture and deployment options for vRealize Ops. And I'll call it vRealize Operations, vRealize Ops, vROps, so don't get confused there. I'm all talking about the same thing. The base architecture is the way we package it all is in a single virtual appliance. The single virtual appliance contains all the features and capabilities, services, etc., that you need for any of the different components of vRealize Operations. There's a variety of configuration options you can pick while you're starting it up, so you can easily set up the environment the way you need to. vRealize Operations scales up and scales out horizontally. The idea here is that we, in being able to scale up both an individual node or add more nodes creating a cluster, we can scale to the size of your environment. Today we support up to 16 nodes in a single cluster, share data and functions across all the nodes in a cluster, so that if we do a query and some of the data is on different nodes, the in-memory database will distribute the queries across the different nodes to make sure all the relevant data is returned. Also, you can connect to any node within the cluster to get UI capabilities so that, again, I can come in at any location, spread my UI load across any of the nodes in the cluster, and get better performance. One of the things this clustering architecture gives us is the ability to support high availability. This means, in this case, it means that we will be able to, if one node goes away, the rest of vRealize operations will continue to run without any data loss. One of the things I do want to point out here, I just didn't have another place to put it, is that everything inside vRealize Ops is controlled through object-based access control. You have to have a user ID. That user ID has permissions, and each of those permissions has a role and a scope that you are allowed to either see or not see, and what you can do against specific objects inside the environment. Now, by objects, I mean just about anything. These are the things that vRealize Ops keeps track of inside of vCenter, inside of your extended environment. An object can be a VM, it can be a data center, it can be a host, it can be a cluster, it can be a guest OS. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but more of that is covered in other webinars. vRealize Operations Manager is a collection-based architecture. We use an adapter to go out and collect the data from the resource that we want to bring data in from. So by default in vRealize Operations Standard and with Advanced and Enterprise, all come standard with the vCenter adapter. The vCenter adapter is pre-installed. This is the component that allows you to connect to vCenter, and we'll be showing you that a little bit later. The idea here is that once the data is being brought in, it's then processed, pre-processed, and then put into the rest of the vRealize operations. If you're set up in a cluster, the system will automatically distribute the data across all the nodes in the cluster. There's nothing special that you have to do. In vRealize Operations Advanced and Enterprise, what we also here allow you to do is add in other management packs. Adapters are really just parts of the management pack. Adapters are the component in the management pack that bring in data from other sources. Management packs can also contain views, alerts, supermetrics, and reports. They contain a lot more than just the adapters. The adapters are the part that actually connect to the other source to bring in data. So in this case, you're seeing EPO, vSAN, Dell, EMC, NSX, NetApp, Microsoft SQL, and Oracle. We have over 40 different management packs that are available from Solutions Exchange. Solutions Exchange is VMware's marketplace. Install and download add-ons to our various products. So if you go into the vRealize Operations sections, you'll have a list of management packs that you can download for each of the versions of vRealize Operations. Now, why I'm telling you all this at this point is just to point out that vRealize Operations is data agnostic. Whether the data comes from vCenter or the data comes from NSX or the data comes from Oracle or Microsoft SQL or Cisco or F5 or any other storage or network device, vRealize Operations treats that data the same. There's an object and there are metrics and properties associated with that object. And you have either rights, access, or modify those resources or view those resources. All the data, once it's into vRealize Operation, is treated exactly the same. So we've got a nice architecture. We build relationships between the different things. And it's very flexible on the amount of data that it can bring in. This is why sizing the environment is so important. Another part of the architecture is remote collectors. Remote collectors, you have an option when you're deploying the virtual appliance. You can tell it whether it's going to be a full node or a remote collector. A remote collector has only subset of all the services running on it that a full node, data node, or master node will have inside the cluster. Remote collectors can be used just as it sounds to collect data from remote locations that may have network latencies that are higher than the cluster requires. The remote collectors can also be used to bring in data and offload the amount of data ingestion that a data node has to do. So if I have a very large environment, I may decide to deploy remote collectors locally to ensure that the processing node or the data node has enough resources, doesn't have to do all the work of collecting the data. And it can just ingest the data in a pre-formatted way from the remote collector. One thing I want to point out at this point, when you're setting up the networking for the cluster, make sure you've got your DNS set up correctly and you're using fully qualified domain names for each of the nodes within the cluster, as well as setting up a fully qualified domain name for the cluster itself. This way you can put a load balancer in front of the cluster, have your UI users, your administrators, anybody who's going to be using vRealize ops initially will hit the load balancer, and the load of the UI can be spread across the different nodes inside the cluster. This will increase your performance for your users. So let's talk about sizing and scalability. Again, like I mentioned, undersizing vRealize operations has been a big problem with a lot of our customers. They initially size for their initial deployment and then add in additional vCenters or add in management packs. Each one of those additional vCenters and management packs will bring their own amount of objects and metrics and properties into vRealize operations. And then you have to remember that we're collecting data at 5-minute increments by default, and then we're saving by default 6 months of data. That adds up pretty quick. While things can start out just fine, you've got your initial, let's say, 4 vCenters as an example. You've sized it properly for that, but then you're going to add in another set of vCenters. What you need to do is rerun the sizing, make sure you're sized appropriately for the number of objects and metrics and properties that you're going to be bringing in. So the maximum number of objects today is 120,000 objects. We support millions of metrics. You'll see that coming up. Maximum cluster size, like I said just a second ago, is 16 node cluster. This does not include remote collectors, so you can have multiple remote collectors. The maximum number of remote collectors that is certified to run in a vRealize ops instance, by instance I mean a single cluster group that's all talking together, is 50. The maximum number of VMware vCenter adapter instances that were tested on a single collector is 30. So we just want to make sure that we're not trying to collect from more than 30 vCenters in a single node environment. Maximum number of vCenter adapter instances total for a cluster has only been tested to 50. So again, you want to keep these in mind as you go through your planning. The other thing is that high availability will double the amount of data that you're storing. So it's going to double the resources and reduce your maximums by half. So you have to keep that in mind if you want to run in an HA mode. One of the key things is always refer to your the version you're running KB article on sizing. What we have is the sizing guide for sizing guides. This is a KB article that talks about all the different sizing guides for all the 6.0 versions of vRealize Operations Manager. In this case, we're going to be specifically looking at 6.4 and its sizing guide requirements. Now, once you open up the knowledge base article, it breaks down into the knowledge base chart breaks down into 3 major sections. This first section talks about node size. These node sizes are configured when you're actually deploying the vApp. You tell it what size the node's going to be, and it will then configure it appropriately with the settings the settings that you see here. What we've also got in this section, as we move more towards the bottom, is that we will have sections down here that are talking about the maximums. What else do you need So for an extra small environment, you see that we're going to have 2 vCPUs, 8 gigabytes of memory, and it will configure those by default. But it also says, what do you need for data store latency? What do you need for network latency? What do you need for those different pieces? As well as down in this bottom section here, it will talk about what are the maximums that you could have. So in a extra small node, you can see that you'll have a maximum number of objects as 250. Not really great for any sort of production environment, but for testing or for proof of concepts, things like that, if you've sized it properly, the extra small may be enough. I almost always use the small node configuration, but as my minimum. But again, that does require 4 vCPUs and 16 gigabytes of memory, and our large goes up to 16 vCPUs and 48 gigs of memory. Now, these are generalizations. There's actually a sizing spreadsheet that we'll talk about in just a few minutes that will allow you to get much closer in detail. The next section of this chart talks about remote collectors. So over here we've got the different sizes of remote collectors. We have 2 sizes of those, standard size and the large size. It also talks about what its maximums are and what it's going to be able to bring in as far as data. Notice there are no storage maximums, what it's going to keep or how many objects and metrics it's going to keep, but it does talk about what's being collected. And again, in the middle, you really want to take a look at this section. These are some hard and fast requirements that we expect, that the cluster expects to have availability between the cluster nodes and between storage. If you don't hit these, you will be directly affecting the performance of the cluster. So you really want to, and you'll see that in, if you don't hit these, you'll be seeing that as poor performance in the user interface. So the sizing spreadsheet, there's a couple of different versions of it. There's the basic sizing guide. So it's basically a tab in the spreadsheet. So it's the sizing guide basic tab. And this is really not good enough for most customers. It does work okay for smaller vRealize operations standard only. Once you get into a larger size environment, I would say 2,000 VMs and up, you really want to start in all cases using the advanced tab. Another thing about the basic guide is that the basic tab in the spreadsheet is that remote collectors are not part of this calculation. So all I'm doing is figuring out how many nodes, and I'm not figuring in remote collectors. Now remember I said remote collectors can be used to offload the data collection chores of the actual data nodes of the cluster. Let's take a quick look at the KB articles themselves. A little more interesting than looking at the screenshots. So again, this is the base KB article. It's the one that's got the listing of all the different KB articles for all the different versions. The one we're going to use today is for vRealize Operations 6.4, our latest release. So once you get into that, here's that chart that we were looking at just a minute ago. Again, it has all the detail around maximums, what's the different sizes of the nodes, what are the different latencies that you have to be below for the cluster to work properly. It's got a bunch of other detail about some of the information I had in the slides, but there's a lot more detail here. But the most important thing is down here at the bottom of this is the actual spreadsheet that I was showing you earlier. So I'll open up this file, save it to my desktop, and let's bring that right up. So here's the spreadsheet. Now, at the bottom, you've got the main sheet is really just a repeat of the data that we had from the from the knowledge base article itself. But again, this is a nice refresher if you print it out. The sizing guide basic, this is what we were just looking at. Again, a little bit more data, and this works out really nice. One of the things that it does have, and again, this is only for vRealize operations standard versions, and for vRealize operations for sizes that are smaller than, I would say, a 2,000 VMs at an absolute maximum. But the nice things here you can do is you can say whether I'm going to install this with HA or not. Now, HA is just a setting inside Ops, and again, it will automatically switch to HA, but you got to make sure that you're sized appropriately for it. The other thing that has a big effect on how big the databases get and things like that and how many nodes you need is the amount of data you're retaining. The amount of data retention is a setting within Ops. You can change that. So you want to keep that in mind, and that you want to size appropriately for the amount of data, the amount of months you want to retain all the data for. And unfortunately, no, you can't split it and say for some vCenters I want to keep 6 months, for other vCenters I want to keep 3 years. It doesn't work that way. It's all or nothing. You either keep it for the whole time, or you don't keep, or you keep it for the default time. And then you can just add in the number of virtual machines. Let me say 250 virtual machines, and I'm going to have 10 hosts, and I'm going to have 25 data stores. I don't know. And what it does is it's going to give me very quickly how many nodes do I need for this environment. And you can see that I've got a very small environment. It sees that extra small is not going to support this. If I have one, I can have one small node, and I would need the disk size, the IOPS per node, the number of vCPUs and the total memory. Now, if I bring this up and I go to 1,000, just let's say, you can see that the number of objects goes up. It's also doing the math based on the number of metrics that we support. Again, it's a relatively simple, straightforward setup. I strongly encourage you, though, if you get to be above 1,000 to 2,000, you really start looking into the advanced spreadsheet, the advanced tab on this spreadsheet. So if you look here down at the bottom, there's the advanced tab. And again, you can see that there's a lot more different types of input that you can go through. The number of vCenter servers. So let's say I'm going to have 10 vCenters. I've got a bunch of customers with 10 vCenters. Number of data centers per vCenter. Let's say I'm going to have 6. Number of clusters per vCenter. 12. Number of vSphere hosts. The total, notice they go from, this is per vCenter, and now they switch to total number of vSphere hosts. So you'd have to now know how many hosts you're going to have on an average between those. So I'm going to say 200 hosts. My number of VMs is going to be 4,000 VMs, and so on through the environment. As I do that, as I answer these questions, it's going to tell me, it's going to fill out that data in the results tab. We also want to point out that you have tabs for the management pack for storage devices as well as EMC ESA. Along with, on the advanced tab, there's some places to put additional information. But notice up here in the top that as I filled in the data on that first sheet, it starts putting in the numbers, figuring out how many metrics. We automatically know how many metrics that we're actually collecting by default for each of these different types of objects. Notice that the vCenters, each vCenter has 267 metrics for the resource, per resource, so times 10, and we get 2,670 collected metrics. and that gets totaled down here. We also have entries for Endpoint Operations Manager, Hyperic objects. The management pack for storage devices will automatically be brought over from its tab, which is over here. We've got NSX for vSphere components, view for Horizon. Again, you can put in how many desktops, user sessions you have, things like that. The EMC adapter will bring in its own data from the entry in this tab down here. And then at this point, you'll start getting data for what is going to be supported. So notice extra small is not supported at all. Small is supported, but it recommends using larger nodes. So in this case, it says 2 medium nodes and gives you the disk IOPS, total vCPUs, and total memory per node that you're going to need. I really recommend you using the larger size, this larger size. Again, I want to point out that it's one of those things that this bites our customers when they do the install. They size it for their initial environment, which may be, maybe 1 to 4 vCenters, and they don't go beyond that. But then they add management packs, they add additional vCenters into the environment, and all of a sudden they start running out of space. So now I'll switch back to the presentation. We've got a couple more things to run through, and then I'll jump into the demo. So we're all done here. This is just a blow up, if you couldn't see it at the bottom of my screen during the demo, that the tabs at the bottom of the spreadsheet, we've got the sizing guide basic tab, and then we've got that advanced vSphere input tab, as well as the management pack for storage devices, the EMC storage, and then the advanced entries and results tab, which will give you the sizing information based on what you put into these other 3 tabs. The advanced sizing guideline is critical for larger environments. It's absolutely necessary when deploying any management packs other than the vCenter management pack, just the standard vCenter. Some of the management packs are included in the sizing documents, but some of them are not. So that what I'd like to let you know is that there is a way to go out and actually test the size of a management pack. So I can actually connect it to a sample vCenter, and I'm going to run through that process right now. So how do you test size for an environment? So what we're going to do is, to test the size, is what we do is we usually set up a single node vRealize ops cluster. So a single node cluster is not really a cluster, but it's an instance. So we'll have that instance of vRealize ops up and running, where it's only going to be temporary. I either use a medium or large node for this. It doesn't really matter, because you're not going to stay connected for that long. In fact, the idea is to just stay connected long enough to do the discovery. This discovery will give you all the information you need to know about a particular connection that a management pack would have. It will tell you all the objects, metrics, and properties that it's going to collect from that resource, and so that it can then bring those in. And what we're looking for is the number of objects and metrics that are going to be brought in, and then we can tell you how then you can add those to the spreadsheet. So what you really do is we install each management pack into this temporary version of vRealize ops. Then we connect the management pack to each resource provider. So if I'm going to connect to Microsoft SQL Server, I can connect to the SQL Manager, and I can actually bring in the data about the SQL servers. If I'm going to go connect to Oracle, I connect to the Oracle Manager or the EMC Manager. I'd connect that, give it the passwords, and then let it do discovery. Let it run for 30 minutes, then disconnect it. Then what you can do is you can go into that instance of vRealize operations and go into the administration tab. Now I've got that circled right here. Now there's the administration button. It'll also have administration in this menu, in the previous menu from here. But again, you've always got these quick link buttons right there, and you can click on that and go into administration. You want to go into cluster management, and then each one of these are going to be, these blue lines here, are going to be a adapter that you're running, a connection that you're going to be running. Each one of these connections is going to give you the detail below in the chart of the number of objects and metrics. You don't want to use the objects and metrics up in the top. These are GemFire objects and metrics. They are not the same as what we're doing for sizing. These are numbers that GemFire uses internally. But the numbers that you want are down here. Now, I've only got one connection to one vCenter in this example, but if I had multiple vCenters here, they'd each be here, and I would click on each one. If I had a connection to multiple Oracle instances, I'd have a connection. I'd see each of those connections here, and I would click on each one to look at the objects and metrics that it's discovered through that connection. Now what you want to do is now just take all these objects and metrics and add those into your spreadsheet. So let's go into the demo. What I'm first going to do is switch over to my virtual environment. So here is a vCenter. As you can see, I've got a bunch of vRealize operation virtual appliances already installed. This is just because I'm going to play Easy Bake Oven, and I'm going to move things around. And these are each in different states of installation, so that I don't have to drag you through and have you sit through watching the bits copy and that kind of stuff. So this will easily be set up, and we'll get going with this. So the first thing we're going to do is deploy the virtual appliance. So you need to get the virtual appliance into a place where you can easily get to it. So what we first do is we're deploying an OVF. I know it's an OVA, but yeah, it's the same thing in deploying an OVF. And you can see here that I've got the OVA file format. And it knows where it is because I've already deployed this a couple of times, but you'll have to just browse to it. It needs to be someplace that this system that we're going to deploy it from can get to it. So I'm just going to hit next. It's going to give you the standard, hey, this is what we're going to install. It reads the OVA and figures out what's there. You have to accept the licensing agreement. Region, what data center is it going to go into? So I'll select that. I also give it a virtual appliance name. In this case, I'm going to do 4A. Just change that. So we'll have another one in there to play with later if we need it. My configuration is going to be small. Again, you've got a bunch of different options. These are the same options I talked to you about earlier. We've got medium, large, remote collector standard, remote collector large, and extra small. Only if you are an extra small environment. We're really looking at less than 250 VMs. Do you want to ever do an extra small? Remember again that all cluster nodes have to be the same size, and really what you should be looking at is starting at a small and then working your way up from there. So I'm just going to do small. I'm going to tell it what cluster to put it in. Now there's a couple of things on clustering. Use DRS. Always have DRS turned on in all your clusters. Make sure you have affinity rules set up so that things that shouldn't be together shouldn't be together. So if I was going to set up a cluster, I'd want DRS on, and then I'd want to make sure that each of the vRealize operations servers is on a different host if possible. So again, I'd want to make sure that if I've got a 3-node or a 4-node cluster, each one of those nodes is running on a separate host. This way, in case I lose a host, ops is still running, things like that. Also, I'm going to get better performance because when they all go into the analytics cycle, I'm not going to be just crushing one poor host. So that's a couple of things for the consideration there. I'm going to hit next. Now for data store, I've only got one data store, so it just tells me where I can put it. The important piece is down here. Now I'm going to select thin provisioned. You should never, if you're doing the test scenario that we talked about just a minute ago, thin provisioning is fine. You don't need a lot of performance. You just need to collect data so that you can look at the number of objects and metrics for each piece. But if you select thin provision for a production environment, this will significantly negatively impact performance. I'm going to select thin provision because I know I don't have a lot of disk space in this one. Again, thick provision, lazy zeroed, or thin provision, eager zeroed, your choice on that one. But again, you want to be thick provisioned. If you want to be thin provisioned, but you know that your storage in the back end can handle it, and what I'm going to recommend is you go back to the IOPS recommendations in the spreadsheet to figure out if you actually can or not. So again, talk to your storage people. If you really want to do thin provision, make sure you have the IOPS. Make sure that as it's growing, it will be able to sustain that level of IOPS. That's the key there. But anyway, 90%, 99% of my customers are thick provisioned. For performance, you definitely do not want to be thin provisioned unless you've done a serious amount of homework. Next thing is your networking. Again, all the networking available to your environment will show up here, and you can select the appropriate network. A couple important things here is you want to make sure you have your time zone set to the same time zone that you've got in all your other appliances. Again, timing is critical. You can't correlate data if the things that happen at the same time, the system thinks happened at different times. So again, just make sure that you've got the same time zone set for each one. There we go. US Eastern, which is where I am. IPv6 if you want it. I mentioned earlier in the slides about the default gateway and DNS. I don't have those running here. Don't need them. We're not going to go into production with this system. But if you're going to go into production, you need to put these in. These need to be fully qualified domain names. Do not put IP addresses. On the other hand, down here where you add the IP address, 192.168.110. What am I up to here? 180. 55. Let me just put this subnet in. Apologize for my slow typing. Again, you want to get this right so all the nodes will be able to talk to each other. This is critical. They need to be on the same subnet, obviously, in the cluster. But again, like I said, make sure you put your fully qualified domain names here. Do not use DHCP. Do not use DHCP for your nodes. While you can, we do not recommend it. Oh, if you're doing the test scenario and you're going to delete the server anyway, feel free to use DHCP. Now you can choose to either power on right after deployment. I'm going to not at this point because I've only got a limited amount of resources in the test environment. What I'm going to do is just scan through here, make sure everything's all right, specifically the IP addresses, because if the nodes in the cluster can't talk, you might as well just start over. So I'm going to hit finish. I've got my normal OVA deployment or VF deployment starting right up here. Everything's moving along just fine. At this point, we will switch over to another environment. Now I'm going to switch to one of my pre-installed virtual appliances. I'm going to start it up. This is the first time I'm starting it. So we've got the system starting up. What I'm going to do is just quickly bring up a console on this. You can see that it's a standard Linux, VMware Linux distribution virtual appliance startup process. It's going to run through. There's nothing really here that you need to do. We just had to get this up and running to be able to actually go in and do the rest of the configuration. Didn't even need to show you that, but what we're going to do is go into the web browser now. So I'm using Chrome here. I'm going to go into connect to the IP address of the vRealize operations node. And what will happen is you can see here that I've been redirected to the admin site. The admin site is where you do cluster management. You have choices between an express installation, but that will answer all the questions for you and wouldn't be very much of an interesting demo. I'm going to do the new installation. For a new installation, it creates the master node of the cluster. So you can read more about the architecture and how the master and the backup master works, and when you're running in a HA environment, as well as how the master works with these standard data nodes. It really just involves having a couple of additional databases that contain configuration files and the user management files, records as well. So I'm going to select New Implementation. Gives you a quick little diagram of what you're going to have to go through to get this up and running. So first thing is the getting started. And the thing is that first off, we're going to be in the administration UI. We'll do the initial setup, and then we'll start the cluster. Then we'll move over to the product UI, and we'll add licenses, and we'll install and configure solutions. Like I said during the architecture section, the configure solutions means connecting to a vCenter, connecting if you have advanced or enterprise, connecting to other infrastructure or application level monitoring systems that we can bring that data into vRealize Ops. Two-step process. We're going to do the administration side first. I'm going to say next. We're going to give it a password for the administrator account, and I'm going to use the VMware standard demo password so I don't forget it. Type it very carefully so I don't mess it up during the demo here. The third step is all about certificates. vRealize Operations comes with a default certificate. You can use that, but if you've got a certificate, if you've got a certificate system, you want to make sure you install that here. You can actually click on it and then browse to the certificate. If you're doing the test, doesn't matter. If you are going into production, you want to make sure that you've got your corporate certificate that you're going to use available. I'm just going to skip. The cluster name is going to be, I'm just going to call it vROps. I'm going to call it master. I don't have to call it master. I'm just going to call it vROps node 1. You can call it whatever you like. This is just a name, and I'll put actually an A on the end to stay with my naming conventions. The next piece is the NTP server address. Remember, I told you about time being important. So you have to have the time zone correct, as well as you need to be using an NTP service so that all your nodes in a cluster and your remote collectors all are in sync as far as time. Time series data isn't good if the times are not correct. And at this point, I'm ready to go. Those were the whole questions, that first one, and I'm going to go off and finish this. So this will go off and run. It will bring up the administration UI. This is the admin UI, and up in the upper left here, it's telling configuration. Once configuring is done, this start button will be available. I also, once it's running, I'll have the ability to turn on or turn off HA. If I turn on HA, I need to have the nodes here. All the nodes in the cluster will show up down below here. And as I click on a node, it will give me the adapters that are installed on that node. I also have an ability from this screen to install software updates. It's very easy to install a update, as well as go out into support, look at logs, create a bundle, and that is I usually use that with GSS. There's also a management and a content pack for vRealize Log Insight that will pull those logs and make it easier to search and find what you're looking for. So we're going to start vRealize Operations Manager from here, and then we'll go into the standard UI and get it running. It does bring up a note that the first time you want to ensure that the cluster has adequate number of nodes to manage your environment efficiently. Notice they're warning you about you should have done your sizing correctly. You want to make sure that it's sized correctly. A lot of our customers have sized incorrectly, and that's where they have problems. I sound like a broken record around that one, but again, it does come back to bite you if you don't size correctly up front. So I'm going to say yes. It starts initializing. Once it's running here, it will say that it's running, and then I can go over to the standard user interface, which would be 10.175, and it would be the UI. Again, bear in mind, if you are using multiple nodes, use fully qualified domain names. Make sure you have DNS in front of that. You can set up a load balancer and then balance between all the primary nodes inside the cluster. All the nodes except for the remote collectors. Remote collectors do not do UI. So let's switch out to another system at this point. And I'm going to go into this environment right here, connect to that one, where I've already got a vRealize operations up and running, bringing in data. You can see the new home screen. For those of you who haven't seen 6.4 yet, this is the new landing page for 6.3 and 6.4, and that'll be covered in another webinar. So what we're going to do is switch to administration. You can either hit this quick link here, or you can just go into the navigation pane and just hit administration. Once we do that, we're going to go into solutions. Now this system has a bunch of solutions already installed. You'll have the vCenter one here, but you got to be careful. That vCenter one here is our endpoint operations, a subject for another day, but that's not the one you're looking for. What we're looking for is the vSphere solution, and it says manages vSphere objects. In this list, you'll only have 2 or 3 things that are in here by default. This one obviously has a lot of solutions already installed, and you don't have to worry about those. But again, I just selected the vSphere one. It's got 2 connections to vCenters, 2 different vCenters already. And what we're going to do is walk through the process of configuring another one. So let's go in and go into Edit and Configure. So the first time through, you would connect on this one, and you would also hit Edit, and that would allow you to create another instance of the adapter. Each one of these connections to a vCenter is a connection instance. At least that's what we call it. And so I can look at that, and I can look at the settings for these, or I can go in and create a new one, which is what I'm going to do. Now, since I don't have additional vCenters here, I'm just going to connect to another vCenter. It's always important to put the vCenter name here, and I'm going to just call it VC dash. I'm just going to call it mic test, actually. This way they know they can come in here and delete it after I'm done with this. But the vCenter is going to be the same, but in your case, you'd be entering this for the first time on your for your environment. So I put my vCenter management in here. Now the first time through, you're going to need to go in and create a credential. The credential name, usually we would recommend a service account with the right privileges to be able to access vCenter. Now this has to be an administrative account. If you don't want to give full administrative rights, I'm going to tell you to go into the documentation and look up the minimum level of rights that you need. I'm not going to tell you because I'll miss one. But I want you to go out and actually look them up if you want to limit the amount of rights that the credential needs. And then you can type in the username and the password that has access to that vCenter. I'm just going to take one of the ones that we already have set up. This vCenter credential is already got the service account that we've set up for accessing the vCenters in our test lab. So I've selected that. Now, the next question is, do I want to enable actions? Actions are the ability to do work against the vCenter. You need an additional set of rights in vCenter to be able to have action, to able to take actions. Because what will happen is the adapter becomes bidirectional. Not only does it pull data out of vCenter, but it also now can send PowerCLI commands to no, not PowerCLI, Python commands to vCenter and actually have it take action on your behalf. Now, it only will allow people who have the rights to do actions to actually see the actions and actually execute the actions. And you can also set up separate credentials for actions as well right here. So I can add a different credential for actions and have a single credential for another credential for bringing in data. Once you've done this, the first thing you want to do is do a test connection. You want to make sure that the connection is okay and it can reach the vCenter. The next thing you want to do is take a look at advanced settings. You don't have to look at advanced settings. The advanced settings are here. I would leave these by default. I wouldn't change any of these. Even if you think you know what you're doing, I would leave these alone, especially here. If you've got only a number of licenses, you don't control licenses here. Licenses are controlled through the licensing mechanism. Do not change this. Just leave it alone. This way, if you ever do have a problem with the environment, GSS isn't sorting through these things that you don't need to set. Again, if they tell you to set one of those based on your environment, go right ahead. Now, if this was the first vCenter we were connecting to, I'm going to hit the Define Monitoring Goals button. But this wizard, this set of questions would come up in a wizard format, and you'd have to answer these. These are the questions that are going to modify and adjust the default policy. What type of alerting? How are we going to configure the default policy at a very base level? So this is the default policy for all objects in vCenter. So the first time through, this will come up. Any other time, you got to go in and modify this. Same questions. So in this case, is which objects do you want to be alerted on in your environment? Now, again, you may want to get all your objects, so virtual machines and host clusters, etc. Or I just may want the infrastructure objects themselves without virtual machine alerts. Or I may only want virtual machine alerts. I would do the alerting on all vSphere objects. I would set that. Now again, you can go into the policy and change these settings back. So you can come in here and reset these, but you're really better off going into the policy and adjusting them there. There's a whole webinar on policies that one of my colleagues did. Definitely go up to the website, review that for going in and changing policies. Now this is saying, what types of alerts do you want? I would recommend turning off efficiency, because you'll get efficiency alerts based on the policy, but you haven't defined, and we're really not defining in any detail here, what you want as far as efficiency, and do you want the alerting for that. Risk and alerts, again, these are going to be for the default settings that we've got. They're not necessarily going to be right for you. I always leave these on so that this way you can get a feel for them. You can always go in and remove them. 6.4 and later has a great options for bulk disabling or enabling policies settings so that you can go in and enable or disable alerts. So if you get too many or there's certain ones that you don't want, it's very easy for you to go in and in a bulk manner turn off the alerts you don't want for any policy. So I would leave these two on, but these are the ones you'll get alerts on. Don't be surprised if you start getting a lot of alerts right away. The other thing is configure memory capacity based on, and do you want it to match vSphere default, most aggressive, or most conservative? So most aggressive would be great for your test dev environments. Most conservative would be really good for your mission critical production environments. vSphere default is usually pretty good, but all those metrics are still collected and you can see them. And that is our allocation based, which is most conservative, demand based is most aggressive, and vSphere default. The other thing that you're going to get asked is, do you want to turn on your vSphere hardening guide alerts? I would only recommend this if you're using the vSphere hardening guide, and you may want to come back and turn those on later. So again, you don't want the system giving you too many alerts right in the beginning. So all I've got to do, by the way, you have to have at least one of these checked off to be able to save this. I will go out and save that. It will update the default policy for this adapter. It says the default policy has been successfully configured. Now again, it's only the default policy for the vCenters I'm connecting to this adapter instance. So there's my adapter, and now I have 3 instances of that adapter. Each one will go out and collect its own data from its own vCenter. In this case, of course, yes, I got this configured as the same as this one, and I will delete that. And all I have to do at this point is save my settings and close the window. And I'm going to discard changes just to keep this environment in good shape. So now we're back here. Now on to the next step. So in this section, you saw how to add a vCenter to a vRealize Operations Manager system. And now, then you also saw the policy questions that we went through. So now we're going to go back to slides just for a minute and wrap up. Some installation considerations. Again, I'm a broken record about this, but it's really important. Use the sizing guidelines KB and the spreadsheet. All cluster nodes need to be the same size. vRealize Ops assumes that all nodes are the same size. So if you increase the size of a node, it's going to waste that space. It's not going to know that it's there. All the nodes must be the same size. There's a KB article on how to increase the size of the nodes. Use fixed IP addresses and the correct DNS entries. Use an NTP service for all the nodes. This again is another one of those important steps. You need to make sure that all the nodes and the remote collectors are synchronized from a time point of view. They don't need to be in the same time zone, but they need to be using the same service and understand what time zone they're in. Fully qualified domain name for the cluster and load balance for UI performance. Again, if all your people are going to a single UI node, that node's going to run slower, so you want to spread your users across all the nodes in your cluster. For storage, do not thin provision. Ops will grow continuously. This is important. I know your storage guys are going to fight this. You really want to work with them very closely. IOPS is the key thing here. You need to be able to put that data in and ingest that data very quickly. DRS affinity rules, keep the nodes on separate hosts if possible, and watch your utilization on the host during the analytics cycles. The analytics cycles are going to be the big processing where it figures out all the analytics for the metrics and properties and objects that it's brought in. So you want to keep track of that and make sure you've got enough horsepower inside your environment to complete the analytics cycle before people start using the system the next day. So a quick slide about upgrade considerations. If you're moving from an earlier version of 6 to a later version of 6, well, the first thing is if you're prior to 6, don't migrate. 6.0 has been out for this long. Chances are your 5X environment, it's either running and has a lot of data in it that it doesn't need, or you weren't really using it in the first place and it's better just to start over. This way you're not bringing any legacy problems forward in the data. So again, best practice, start from scratch if you haven't moved already. If you do need your 5X environment, run it side by side until you're comfortable with the 6X installation. Always read the release notes for updates on the upgrade information. So I've got information here, but you always want to go to the release notes. A good example is we've changed the underlying database in some of the nodes and for some of the data type storage. A bunch of databases in vRealize Ops, and what we did is we changed the base database from, in some cases, from XDB to Cassandra, And for some of them, we went from XDB to Postgres. This was a performance upgrade. It works just fine, but depending upon where you are, you may need to do a dual step upgrade. So if you're upgrading from 6.0 or 6.1 to 6.4 or newer, you must first upgrade to vRealize Operations 6.3, then upgrade to vRealize Operations Manager 6.4 or better. So the point here is that at 6.2 is where we, or 6.1 is where we did the break off. When we went to 6.2, we changed the underlying databases, and so there's a data conversion in the upgrade. So you need to go to 6.3 first. The 6.3 upgrade will do the data conversion, and then you can do the upgrade to 6.4. The upgrades are pretty simple. You would need to do the whole cluster, but again, you want to make sure you get to 6.3 first. With more recent versions of vRealize Operations Manager, if you're on 6.2 or 6.3, you can go directly to 6.4. Again, check your release notes. That's the most important thing. It will describe what are the steps to do.